tried to elevate myself up to the point where I was actually muling for the cartel. We got pulled over. Dad got dragged out of the car. I remember her screaming, "Don't kill my dad." I was more interested in trying to do what I wanted to do to be successful and survive.
Yeah.
And then trying to manipulate God into that.
What is up, guys? We have a special guest today. I'm excited for this testimony. I know I say that every testimony. I always tell people that when I record testimonies, it's my favorite part of my job because it feels like I'm loading ammunition against the enemy and testifying of the glory of God. So this is I don't know, it's ammunition, but it feels more like artillery today, what God has brought you through. So why don't you tell them your name and just a bird's eye view of where God brought you from before we really break down your story.
Yeah, that's good ammunition. So I mean, my name's Jesse Kaplan, and you know, I'm grateful to be able to tell my story. I would love to load that with ammunition to take it to the enemy. So for my life, it started off, you know, the stage was set pretty early where I was brought up by very young parents in a situation that was, you know, abusive and there was a lot of neglect, and ended up being adopted at 6. And so there was all sorts of struggles that came with from my earlier childhood into then my little bit older childhood, which carried me in through my teenage years, and some struggles and early interactions with the police, you know, growing up in the system essentially, and then leading a life of crime.
Yeah, you went to jail, right?
Well, I've been to jail many, many times. There was a long run for about what I considered a long run of 8 years or so, where I was from 18 to 26, where I actually didn't get arrested, but I was still doing all the things that I should have been arrested for. And then I started getting investigated, and then I started getting arrested, and I started going to prison. And it was during prison that a lot of things started to shift my perspective when it came to Christ. But it took a lot of work, and it took a lot of fall downs to actually get to a place where I was fully surrendered.
Yeah.
Four times being in prison, I think, before you really saw the evidence of that in my life.
Let's talk about it. Let's talk about where you got to. If you guys are curious, he's got the Carfax to prove it. He brought in. You want to talk about this a little bit? What are these pictures?
Yeah, so these are some of the times that I was arrested. Not all of them. I only picked the ones I like the most.
The coolest.
The coolest looking. So it actually starts here at the bottom right as the oldest. So in my mid-20s. My mid-20s, and then it kind of works through and reads that way.
Show this camera. Show the people.
So it reads through at the bottom this way. And, you know, this is a spread of over 10 years.
Wow.
Being incarcerated in prison, and this is the final one here, where I was actually dragged from the car by the police.
Wow.
And looking a little rough, beat up there, and I'd probably been up for too long. I fell asleep in my car with drugs, and
Dang.
they dragged me out of the car, and that was the final time that I was arrested and brought to prison.
Yeah.
And so that was in 2017.
Yeah.
2018.
Yeah. So fairly recent too. So God must have done something crazy for it. Because what are you doing right now?
Yeah. So, well, it seems impossible because it is. But God got a hold of my life, and I now work for Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge. I'm actually a regional manager for the Rochester. So the southern part of the state, I cover about 20 or 21 counties with services and going into prisons and jails.
Wow.
To essentially witness and help
to bring
people.
those out of what you were in.
Yeah,
Praise God.
Exactly.
Well, let's talk about, man, I want to talk about your childhood, because I really feel like those that are listening, why I love testimonies, again, it's because when people listen to this, there's like, people think that their situation is unique. There's nothing like, you know, what I've been through. You don't know what I've been through. Like, I get it, you know, God did this in your life or whatever, but what I've been through is far different. And if you think your situation is unique, the solution is that much more hard to find. So I want to share your testimony, and I want to bring hope to people that might be going through similar things or really feel like they've fallen too far from grace. And so we're going to give people a look into that by starting off at your childhood. What was your upbringing like?
Yeah. And so whether people can relate a lot, a little, or not at all, what I hope people hear is that there's hope.
Yeah.
Right. There's hope for anybody. And so for me, like I mentioned, the stage was set because my mother was just 3 days after her 14th birthday.
Yeah.
When she had me. So she was very young.
Wow.
In fact, she was first, her family came from what was then the USSR. My grandparents were in USSR, now known as Kiev, Ukraine. And she came here then as a refugee. And so coming from a different cultural background, being very young herself, gave birth to me. My dad is also a teenager, though he was from the States, from here, just a few years older, so also a teenager. And so my mom and my dad were obviously very young and didn't do all that well at managing a baby.
Yeah.
And I guess I don't remember a ton from that point, but I do start having memories when my younger brother was born, which was just 14 months after.
Wow.
I think they call that Irish twins.
Irish twins. Yeah.
So we were super close. I just remember immediately, he was like my little, there was a commercial called My Buddy.
Yeah.
Everywhere I go, he goes. Mm-hmm. And was the relationship between me and my little brother.
Yeah.
I would tote him around by the hand everywhere I went. I would explain everything that I knew about life as big brother. Mm-hmm. And he was my best friend. Mm-hmm. And so I finally had a friend. I think I had somebody to spend my time with. And so what was already a very unstructured situation, what I mean by that is, I didn't have a reference point for this, by the way. So growing up, life was just life.
Yeah. And this is hindsight. You're looking back and you're like, that wasn't normal.
I didn't have a reference point, one, because I wasn't even in school yet. So I didn't really have much interactions with other people outside of my home. Mm-hmm. But we fended for ourselves when it came for food. Toddlers, literally not always counting on a food, being on the table. Like I said, no point of reference for this, just thought this was normal.
Wow.
And so, was used to kind of going into the fridge or trying to help myself when it came to stuff like that. And I'm sure, my mom did provide some of that. I just don't think it was regular. It wasn't as regular as what I know is from my point of reference now, is taking care of your children. It also meant things like, I wasn't, having clean clothes or things like that all the time. I think a lot of times I was running around without clothes.
Yeah.
So was my brother.
Yeah.
But that was normal. Wow. That was normal for us. Nobody was telling me to brush my teeth or turn the TV off or when to go to bed and stuff like that. So it was just kind of like a free for all.
Yeah.
And so, that was the situation. And then when I was about 4 years old, I remember my mom came in and she told me that my dad had went on vacation. And at 4, I didn't know what vacation meant. I asked her, what's that? And she told me that it's a ship that sails into the sky and never comes back again. Jeez. And so I sort of assumed my dad was never coming back and maybe dead, right? I just said he was gone. And I don't even think at 4 years old you totally comprehend death.
Oh, yeah.
But I did grow up thinking my dad was dead. But at that point, things took a turn for the worst, because now my dad was no longer in the picture, and my mom, who's then 17, 18 years old at the time, is now still in high school, works a night job, and she leaves us in the care of my uncle. His name was Roman. When she's not around. And my uncle is actually a year younger than my mom. So my uncle's maybe 17 years old. And I didn't know it at the time, either because I never saw it or I just didn't know what I was seeing, but he had a heroin addiction. And so what would happen regularly, weekly, if not more than once a week, was he would take my brother and I, and he'd put us in our bedroom. And he would I remember it still vividly. I can picture the vacuum in my mind. He'd take the vacuum cleaner and he would take the cord from it and he would wrap it around the door handle from the bedroom or the bathroom door handle across the hallway from our bedroom. And he would create a tension line and then he'd put us in there and he'd shut the door and I could hear him wrapping the cord around the other side. And at 4 and 5 years old, I could not open that door, right? I would pull on it and I couldn't open it. But he'd leave us in there. And I think what I imagine now is that he was probably, while he was using drugs, and in his mind was probably trying to insulate us so he could do what he was doing without us being exposed to it, right? Which might be part of the reason I just never saw it or never knew that's what it was. But this would happen all the time, right? Like weekly, if not, like I said, more than once a week. And during these times, I had to adapt. And so my brother and I would be in there, and it wouldn't just be for like a few hours. Like I said, my mom worked a night job. Sometimes I wouldn't see my mom for a couple days. And so she probably is also being a teenager, probably also going out. And so it could be a morning like it is now, and I might not get out to the next day in the evening. So it would be long periods of time.
How old were you when that
started? When I was about 4 years old, when my dad was no longer around. I don't recall that ever happening until my dad was no longer around. And so during that time, as you can imagine, I had to adapt. Over the course of a day or two, I would get hungry. And again, with no point of reference, I honestly didn't see like needing food as like that much different than being around our apartment at the time anyways. I still would have to fend for myself. So what I started doing for me and for my little brother is I started putting food in our closet. I would like, if it was whatever I could kind of scavenge, would be like a half a loaf of bread. I remember, cookies. I'm a kid, right? So whatever I could think of, I'd hide in our closet so that we'd have something to eat over the course of the next day or two while we're locked in our room. I remember one time it was chewable vitamin C tablets.
Wow.
And I don't know if you've ever eaten one of those. Like one's like kind of like a sweet tart and yum.
Yeah.
But if you try to eat like 4, 5, 10, they're gross. They're disgusting. And I that was a one-time deal, right? Like I didn't use vitamin C chewable tablets for food after that one time.
Yeah.
But that was the situation. And then of course what goes in must come out, And so I even though the other elements of that were sort of normalized for me in my life and didn't seem to be a huge issue in my mind, obviously that's super neglectful and abusive. But I do recall like just the humiliation or like just the disgust with having to go to the bathroom and not having a place to do that. And so I literally taught my brother and myself, we would go into behind our dresser. We like made a spot, I made a spot for us, and we'd like poop back there, we'd pee back there.
Wow, dude.
So that's how we kind of live. And I don't remember that ever being like called into question by my mom or my uncle or why is there poop behind your dresser? And I don't. It was just like a spot back there that we go, and I'm sure maybe they cleaned it from time to time and thought, I honestly don't know. Jeez. Those are good questions. But there was actually one time when on occasion I stashed a carpenter's hammer, like a regular tool. I put that in the closet, and when my uncle locked us in there, it had been a couple hours. I took that hammer and I went to the apartment floor window and I smashed it out with the hammer. And I took my little brother, my little buddy, and we went out into the neighborhood. It was middle of the day, and
again, for reference for the people, how old were you when you just did this?
Yeah, probably about 5 years old now. Probably about 5 years old.
That is crazy.
So this has been a pattern in my life, and I was able to prepare for it I'm starting to get more creative, what I mean? And so this wasn't towards the beginning. This had been happening for a while. And so I put that hammer in there. This was premeditated.
Wow.
Like I put that hammer in there and broke the window out, smashed it out. Nobody came in the room like wondering what's going on. So my brother and I, we left. We escaped out of our broken window. And we just went out into the neighborhood and we played. There were apartment buildings. They all kind of looked the same as I remember. They were just like a bunch of apartment buildings that were in a collective area. So, but maybe it was spread over a block or two, like very the same, or at least it seemed that way in my mind. And there was another kid in the area. I ended up staying at his house for the night and with my brother. And, so during that was like, there was enough mistrust for like adults that in the morning, like his mom fed us. I remember we got to eat and stuff like that. And I just remember, I thought I was just having fun. Mm-hmm. And then she started asking questions, the mom, in the morning. Yeah. Like, so my brother's 4, I'm 5. And she's like, are you guys okay? Like, does your mom know where you are?
Yeah.
And she started asking questions like that. And, I don't even remember hesitating. Like, I lied to her. And I said, yeah, in fact, my mom's probably expecting us home. And so, yeah, I got to get home. And my mom's probably wondering. And so I left. But of course, the situation we had just left from, I wasn't in a hurry to go back to.
Yeah.
And so, man, I still remember this so vividly. Like, so my brother and I ended up kind of just wandering around that little area and then taking rocks. And I was coaching my brother on, like, hit that window. And so we were just passing time by throwing rocks through windows. And of course,
My favorite pastime.
Yeah. Like, and that was what we were doing, because we didn't want to go home. And then,
Wow.
of course, somebody called the police.
Yeah.
So the police came. My first time being brought home by law enforcement was at 5 years old.
Wow.
I wasn't like being treated poorly by the police officers. Yeah. If anything, I thought at the time, like, I felt pretty safe and secure. Like, I got to ride in the front seat, and he had a gun, and he was very kind to us, and asked where we lived, and we were still within the area, so I was able to point out where we live. And he brought us home, and he knocked on the door, and my mom actually answered the door. So my mom hadn't been there the day before, and I remember my mom kind of opened the door, and he said, "Are these your boys?" And she said, "Yes, they are." And my brother and I just kind of went into the house and sat down in front of the TV. I turned the TV on and started watching cartoons or something. And that's all I remember of that.
You don't remember? Yeah.
I don't remember my mom like coming in after, like, being upset or being worried or being scared about where we were. Now, I don't know what the conversation was like at the door with the officer, but my guess is that sort of started a sort of domino, or at least a course in her thinking in our life, where not too much long after that, when I was 6, my brother and I actually got put up for adoption. Wow. And so there was another pivotal moment. So we ended up being adopted. I don't remember fully understanding what was happening, but I do remember the day where I drove away and my mom was crying, and I was waving to her out the back seat of a car of probably a social worker or somebody from the adoption agency, and we went to go be with our new parents.
Dang, that's heavy. That's put a picture in my. Oh my goodness. Wow. So then what happened? Like, were your adopted parents, were they good to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, you can imagine, two people that, married couple that want to love on kids that aren't theirs, that just want to give them the world. And that saw older kids and still said, yeah, we want to take these two, though they're 5 and 6 years old. And so they did. I think they really had all of the best heart and intentions with it. And they were very well to do. In fact, both my parents were attorneys. So they had, all the stability I'd never had before when it came to resources and finances, and a beautiful house to live in a nice neighborhood, food, regular clothes, like all the things that I never had. And that was great. And they, of course, they put me into competitive sports because I was playing hockey and soccer, and I was really into all this stuff, and my brother as well. At the same time, I do remember nights and really feeling a loss for my mother. I would cry, and I would ask for my mom at times. I would ask for her and say, I want to go see my mom. And they would show me a picture of her or something like that and kind of console me. But I remember at some point, I stopped asking for my mom, but I did struggle in hindsight with feelings of wonder of what was wrong with me. Like, why did my mom not want us?
Wow.
And then my brother was still like my closest. So I think that was sort of a gift in all of it too, is that my brother and I being adopted together was huge, especially being that age and everything we had been through. So we continued with that sort of like peas in a pod, just very close. He's literally the only person I've known all my life, consistently. So growing up like that, being in competitive sports, I was a boy being a boy. I loved video games, loved playing sports. Definitely had the idea of not wanting to use, I went through school programs where I was just going to say no, and I meant it. And I was also into sports, and I knew that I didn't want to add drugs or smoking and things like that to my sports. And I thought I either wanted to be a police officer, probably because of that early on experience, or a professional athlete were kind of the two things, as a boy that I wanted to be when I got older. And so, yeah, so played competitive soccer for over 6 years. Played junior gold hockey. In fact, in elementary school, so like I would do okay at home. I was kind of like, I feel like I was more of the survivalist out of my brother and I. My brother was sort of like kind of the, I don't know how to call it, this like kind of freak out. Like he was like, he would kind of spaz, like
it's the younger brother. That's
yeah. And so like I would try to calm him down.
Yeah.
He was definitely more sensitive. And then, I tried to take care of him and I tried to look out for us, but I was always thinking like outward, like survival. So I would at home, would be more calm and collected and kind of keep my secret things secret, and like I wouldn't let them see like what I was doing wrong, where my brother would throw tantrums and get upset and throw things and stuff like that. But I was having big problems at school from a very early age. I do remember actually before I was adopted, so I had just gotten into kindergarten already, and I do remember getting kicked out of my kindergarten with my biological family for hitting another kid with a chair over taking some crayons or markers or something like that. So, and then, while even after I was adopted, I was still having problems in school, rebelling against teachers, fighting with other kids in school. All of those things were coming out in that area where my brother was doing that and then also having issues at home as well. And so, but we were both in sports. I mean, we're, like I said, kids being kids. I actually transferred from schools a few times. So I was in one school and got kicked out in third grade and went to another school in South Minneapolis called Burroughs Elementary. And then the next year in fourth grade, I actually met Christina, my wife, who's here. And so that she's probably the second person I've known the longest, except for my adoptive family, of course. But, person that had obviously a big part of my story since she's still sitting here today.
Yeah. Hopefully.
Yeah. So, and she was a little rebel back then too, I think. I like the bad boys. Yeah. So I was a rebel at school, and, I even though I didn't intend to use any substances, when I was 11, I'd hung out in the neighborhood a lot. My adoptive parents would try putting rules on me. And though I said I was kind of calm at home, like I still didn't respect boundaries or rules. Like you couldn't tell me what to do. I might not,
good at hiding
I might not argue with you about it, but I was going to leave, or I was going to sneak out, or I was going to do what I wanted anyways.
Yeah.
And so even if I didn't argue, I was still going to have my way. And so I was hanging out with older kids, and they kind of just, I think, were trying their best, the different methods of maybe give them some boundaries, maybe try to tighten them up, and none of it was working. But I was hanging out with these older kids, and one of them was stealing cigarettes from his dad. So at first I started smoking cigarettes and using nicotine, and that led to trying alcohol. I know for me, especially when it was like alcohol, like I would bring it home, I'd hide under my bed. I'd have some for before school, and I started like just sneaking it around, I can recognize those patterns now. And of course then I'm trying those things, and I'm wondering what was the big deal? I mean, I'm able to smoke, I'm able to drink, and I'm still playing sports. I'm still doing me, right? I'm still like, I guess I can do this.
Yeah.
And so, of course then it's just, I'm just not going to do hard drugs.
Yeah.
That's the bad stuff.
Justifying it.
I'm just not going to do the hard drugs. I can do this. I just won't do that. I was wrong about nicotine and alcohol. That's okay.
Yeah.
And so, that started, especially and then it turned into smoking marijuana, smoking weed, around 12 years old. And so I was skipping school by third grade, actually, before I even met Christina. I was skipping school to the park across the street. So just literally doing whatever I felt I wanted to do. Nobody was going to be master over me.
Yeah.
Probably because I had a lot of fear of growing close to anybody. Yeah. So yeah, by the age of 12, I'm smoking marijuana. And that gets kind of expensive as a kid. There was a period where I was in ninth grade, and I had this light bulb moment. I thought, I want to smoke weed all the time. Like every day I wanted to smoke weed. Like I wanted 420 lifestyle as a lifestyle. And so, I thought, well, I'll just sell weed. I'll sell weed to all the kids in school because I know everybody who smokes weed.
Oh man.
So I'll make money and I'll get to smoke weed for free.
Oh no.
And so that was my genius moment, and I started doing that. And I met at the time my best friend, who his brothers, his older cousins and older brothers were drug dealers, and so I had access. To things, and so I'm actually selling weed in my high school, ninth grade, and I go to meet another kid in the bathroom. I'm going to a school that was then called Arlington, in the east side of St. Paul, Rice Street area. It's now called Washington Tech. But I go to meet him in the bathroom, and instead of pulling out money to buy this $10 bag of weed, he pulls out a butterfly knife, and he kind of whips it out. Like probably imagine another boy. He's Jackie Chan'd it. I mean, I'm sure he planned this all night. He planned this all night.
Yeah.
He practiced in the mirror, I'm sure. And it was pretty, I mean, honestly, I remember it was pretty cool. Like if people could flip a butterfly knife like that, you were pretty cool.
Yeah.
But he pulled it out. And so now if you just remember like the way I told you I grew up, and I was just always survival thinking, and really the situation was no different. And so I went in my pocket, but instead of pulling out a bag of weed for him, I pulled out a pistol. And he ran out of the bathroom.
Yeah.
He brought a knife to a gunfight, and it's a literal thing. That's why it's a saying.
Yeah.
And I could hear him as he's running down the hallway. I could literally hear him shouting out, "He's got a gun. He's got a gun." He's repeatedly shouting this out in school.
Oh no.
And my first thought was, wow, dude, he just tried to rob me for drugs with a knife, and now he's telling on me.
Yeah.
And my second thought was survival. I was like, I ain't getting caught. I ain't getting caught with this. So I skipped school, went to my buddy's house, put the drugs and the gun at his house, and then went home. And, just hope for the best, I guess, right? And so
they'll forget about it.
Yeah. Well, 4 a.m. the very next morning, the police actually raided my adoptive dad's house. So I kind of skipped my adoptive family. My adoptive parents actually ended up getting divorced when I was 12.
Yeah.
They struggled a lot. I remember a lot of the fights were about me and my brother.
Oh no.
But they ended up getting divorced when I was 12. But so my adoptive dad's house gets raided, which is where they kind of let us choose. And my brother would often choose my mom's house actually, and I would choose my dad's. But they raided his house, and I remember they ripped the blankets off of me and got me down on the floor. And,
wow.
They didn't find the guns and drugs, but they did find live bullets. I had ammunition that I'd forgotten about in the back of my underwear, sock drawer.
Oh no.
Yeah.
No.
So I was still in big trouble.
Yeah.
That was when I really started first going on like probation as a juvenile. At that point too, like social services got involved. And I remember like my parents voluntarily surrendered us over to the social services system. They had tried other methods. They had tried putting me in boot camps and things like that. But at that point, like I felt the loss again. Like I felt like a confirmation of like this literally is like, it's just me and it's my brother. And like, and in fairness, like my adoptive parents did try, I think, everything they thought they knew how to do at the time. And now my mom, like, was Lutheran, and my adoptive dad was Jewish, and so I grew up with some elements of that, though they weren't like strong followers. I mean, there was occasional times where I went to Easter or Christmas services, or I went to a Saturday school and like studied the Torah, which is the Old Testament. And so I mention that because I do, as we're starting to tell the story, and obviously we're going to get to a different place. I think those moments were important in my story, because I always did grow up in that sense and believing there was a God. Like I just didn't know why he didn't care about me.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like why he doesn't care about me.
Wow.
If there's a God, sure, I believe that, but he just don't see me at all.
That's powerful. Yeah.
And so I ended up being after that. So I'm probably 14 now, and I'm put in a foster care system, back into the foster care system. Although I went from being into a family that was abusive, I was get to adoption, and now I'm in a foster care system, and everything's confirmed for me that it's just me against the world. And then my brother and I are at different ages enough where they put us in different foster cares. It was like the same set of homes, but they had different age groups. And so they would arrange visitation in us, but it just really wasn't good enough. And on the foster home that I was in at the time, later after I had been there, ended up being shut down for neglect, abusive levels of neglect of all things. And if you can imagine like how that probably impacted me too, they would lock us in the basement. So there's a lot of undertones of things that I faced in that time that sort of, though my parents had tried boot camp and I think I did gain some ground and things there, it sort of was like all washed away when I went through a foster home that had those abusive levels of neglect. The food thing was an issue there. They ended up being shut down later, but so what I ended up doing was running away. I'd run away. And my brother started running away too. And so, remember I'm smoking weed, I'm selling weed, and I have another light bulb moment as I'm living life basically on the streets, basically crash couching, staying at friends whose parents are drug addicts. I'm selling weed, and I have that other light bulb moment as well. I'm going to sell hard drugs. I mean, I heard Biggie Small's song, don't get high on your own supply. And I'm like, well, I'm getting high on the weed, but if I sold hard drugs, I can make even more money, and I don't want to use those. So I'll just sell them. I won't use them. And that's what I did. I did that for quite a while. By the age of 15, I was selling crack cocaine to adults coming out of bars and carrying a pistol every single day.
15.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff I'll leave out when it comes to that criminal lifestyle. But if you can imagine, I'm teaching my little brother now because I love him.
Wow.
I love him. I'm teaching him how to do all the things that I'm doing because we got to take care of ourselves. We got to take care of each other. So he's starting to sell. I remember at the time I don't know if it matters that much and what the substance was, but he started grabbing hold of meth more, and I started selling crack cocaine more. But I was still it's somewhere along the line. I can't remember where I started compromising, but I started compromising with pills, ecstasy pills, pain pills. Not that all the time, right? Like I would just party with them, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe it was some lean or some promethazine, things that I could drink in my alcohol, to feel extra good about myself for the party or something. And I wouldn't do it all the time. So I don't remember. And those are absolutely hard drugs. They're hard drugs. And I just didn't realize that they were. They felt safer to me, maybe because they're in a pill form. I don't remember what exactly my reasoning was. But eventually I'm selling hard drugs every day, selling weed too, taking more prescription form, including ecstasy pills. I started taking those too as their pill form. But then I met somebody. So Christina and I actually lost contact when I was 13 years old because of the boot camp my adoptive family sent me to. At that point, her and I lost contact because I wasn't there anymore. So I think she called my parents' house, and they
He doesn't live here anymore.
yeah, they told her he doesn't live here anymore.
That began my 15-year search.
Yeah, so we had lost contact after that. So which is probably a grace because that's when things really started. Like I said, I started selling hard drugs, really going full on lifestyle in the streets. In and out of different juvenile programs at the time. Boys Totem Town, Isani Boys Ranch. My brother was in Elmore Academy. I went to Chamberlain Academy, which is no longer there. So, I mean, I spent as much time being locked up in juvenile and because I was always on the run.
Yeah.
So I always had a warrant. So I had nothing to lose. And so I lived that way. And it was somewhere along the lines, I was 17 years old. And I met a lady who was much older than me, about 10 years older, and she used meth. And I was partying with other pills, and that was the first time I decided to try meth. And again, it wasn't something that just took hold of me, and it was just another party thing. But now I was also willing to try lines of cocaine. I was willing to try other things. I started going to a lot of music festivals, trying all sorts of hallucinogens. And so it was just really now I just became a smorgasbord. But then I set a new bar. I said, well, I'll do hard drugs. I just won't use needles, right? Because that's the bad stuff, right? That's where I'm going to draw the line.
Wow.
You can kind of probably know where this is leading. But so so at the age of 18, actually, I'm, selling hard drugs. I'm now talking to this much older person, and I actually end up going to jail just before I turned 18, and they gave me 6 months. And when I got released from jail, I was 18, and the lady that I was with was pregnant, And so she moved out of state, and I was going to have my first child. So even following the footsteps of my biological family as a teenager, now I'm 17, almost 18, about to have a baby. Definitely in no better position than my parents were to raise a child. And I wasn't for a long time to come, but I wanted to be present for that. And so I asked the courts to let me go, and they gave me the option. They said, you can go and you can leave, literally be banned from the state of Minnesota for no less than 365 days. And if you come back, you will immediately be placed on probation. Or you can just go on adult probation now. Because I obviously hadn't earned my way or proven myself in any way. But so of course, see ya. Yeah. I'm gone. So I moved out of state, was released from probation, and that's probably why I was able to make it for the next 8 years without being called into question, because I didn't have the oversight anymore.
Yeah.
And I was good at surviving. And so that relationship I did get to watch my child be born, my oldest. She'll be 22 this year. But that relationship didn't last more than 8 or 9 months. And so I ended up coming back to Minnesota as soon as my expiration date was over. I actually moved from Louisiana to Michigan during that time. Wasn't too heavy into selling drugs, using, drinking very heavily. And then as soon as I came back to Minnesota, it was like same old friends, same old people, back connected with my brother. So there was a year there, but my brother would visit me. Like he would take a Greyhound and come visit me in Michigan and stuff. But, as soon as it was like I was doing time out of state, just waiting to come back. And so I came back and, right back into the lifestyle, like full on. Of course, my brother has kind of already still been here and been in it. So it was easy connections into everything again. And just had about an 8-year run where I literally thought, and my mentality was that if I can elevate myself in this world, this is how you survive. This is how you make it. Wow. My power, my guns, my drugs, my money will protect me. That lifestyle was my God in a sense. Yeah. I was, in control of that. And the only way to survive then was to elevate myself. And I literally remember thinking at one point, as I looked in the mirror, thinking I made it. I thought I made it. I mean, I remember this. I look at myself now thinking back at that moment, but I remember looking, because I had the big rims. I'm just early 20s. I got multiple places that I rent. I got homes and apartments. I got all these different places. Wow. And I tried to elevate myself up to the point where I was actually muling for the cartel. So I literally thought I made it. If you're that age and you're in your 20s, you're driving a Corvette and you're thinking like, this is it. Everything. Yeah, I got everything I want, and I spend it like there's no tomorrow, because I don't know if there's a tomorrow. Yeah. But tons of drama, tons of crazy things happen in my life. Along with that comes violence. Along with that comes other forms of abuse. You're constantly looking over your shoulder. And of course that wasn't the end of the story, because I started getting investigated. My home started getting raided. In fact, my older daughter was involved in a police raid, and while she was on a visit from out of state, and had to go back. Luckily, my brother, who's also in it, also had warrants, was also out on bail, came and picked her up, brought her to the airport to fly back to her mom. And so a very traumatic, because she used to stay with me for the summer. That was kind of the idea. And so that summer, first summer and last summer ended up with her going, her dad, we got pulled over. Dad got dragged out of the car. I remember her screaming, "Don't kill my dad." And because the police, one of them yelled I had a gun. And I had a cell phone. I didn't have a gun. But I did have a gun in the trunk. So, they weren't too far off. Yeah. I had a gun in the trunk. And then when they searched my home, obviously they found more guns and drugs. And I was just doing all this stuff in front of my kids. I would try my best to hide it. Yeah. I also had my stepdaughter, my daughter's sister, who's a little bit older, once asked me, "Dad, do you have medicine that keeps you up and makes you go to sleep?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I do. It's drugs, but it's yeah." And she said, "Can I have some?" And of course I'm like, "No." She's 12 years old and my daughter's 9. And so that summer ended with me being pulled over in a rental, dragged out of the car, brought back to the apartment. They raided the apartment. I'm sitting on the couch, handcuffed. My kid's sitting next to me while they tear up our apartment, finding all sorts of stuff.
Wow.
And then my own daughter leans over and said, "Dad, they didn't find your backpack, did they?" And so I thought I was cleverly hiding everything.
Wow. She's fully aware. Yeah.
Yeah. But
Jeez.
whatever was in that backpack, she knew wasn't supposed to have that. And I remember sometimes there's times during the summer she said, "Dad, why do people give you all this money? Why do they hand you all that cash?" And I just told her, it's my job. It's my job. I'm just doing my job. That's my job. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And so I started at that point. I started getting arrested. Again, I thought my money, everything could protect me. So I hired private attorneys. Actually on that, if there was before I did my first bid, there was a 2.5 year period where I was under investigation, criminal charges pending, but had a private attorney that just kept doing the song and dance and keeping me out of jail for 2.5 years. During that period, I actually joined the Army. And I did it to survive, right? I thought, if I can join the Army, I might not have to go to prison, because I didn't think there was a very good chance of us beating this case.
Yeah.
But if the longer we could delay it, and then the more I could put distance between then and what I was doing now. And so for only that reason, I actually really struggled to try to get sober for 45 days, enough to pass a UA to do my enlistment. And then I was kind of just smoking weed and drinking after that, just because I knew when my UAs would probably be, and I'd be able to kind of clean up. And so that was the only period I had of somewhat sobriety. But my lifestyle was absolutely the same. I was still selling heavily. But it was my first sort of little bit of a change. And then what ended up happening is I went to court, and, my lawyer was supposed to subpoena particular sergeant and a particular major to the sentencing. He dropped the ball on subpoenaing the major. So the staff sergeant that came was at request from my attorney, but the major that came was at the request of the prosecutor. And so I never met that major. And though I had done, been enlisted, went to boot camp, and was actually on a deployment roster to go to Iraq the very next month. And so this is in September. And I'm supposed to deploy to Iraq. And so the staff sergeant's telling the judge, yes, he's a great soldier. We'd love to keep him and send him. He's on deployment roster. The judge said, okay. He said, well, let me hear from your superior officer. If he can say that you need him, then you can have him. I'll drop these charges. And I'm thinking,
wow.
I'm thinking I'm going home, right? I'm going to go serve a tour, but I'm going home, not going to prison. Well, the major answered it very technically. He said, well, we're at 120 something capacity. I can't say we need him. And the judge was kind of wide-eyed and said, okay, 5 years in prison. And so I got from that, in that instant, it shifted from me thinking I'm going home to no idea I'm actually going home. I'm going, my home is now prison.
Wow.
And so I cried a little bit in that cell by myself for a moment, and because my life was just totally devastated. I had no idea that was going to happen. I'm not saying my life was good. I should have been aware that it was already devastated, but that happened. And so I went to prison. By the way, my brother had already just went to prison a couple years before that, and I didn't mention that. So we were both in this lifestyle, but I always thought I was the smart one, right? I thought stupid people go to jail. Hello.
Yeah. Oh God.
So, but I had an 8-year run, and then I ended up going to prison. And so when I'd get out of prison, I go to prison, I read a lot of books. I actually went to a program that's called Prison Fellowship. Every time I went to prison, I've been to prison 4 times. Every time I'd go to prison, I'd go to this program, and I'd kind of learn about Jesus. It's a Christian program. They teach Christian principles within the prison. And so I remember in 2009 during my first prison stay, so I actually went 2008, and I ended up exiting that prison fellowship program because I wanted to go to boot camp to get an early release. too appealing than staying and finishing that Christian program. But there were seeds that were planted, and I remember we talked about like what was my view of Jesus, and so even having grown up and hearing about God, mostly God of the Torah, but then also some elements of who Jesus was, and then I learned more about that in prison. And I thought, well, I'm a survivor, like I need fire insurance. So I will confess him. I will get baptized. But my heart was still like, I wasn't really following in any sort of way. I was just making the confession of faith. Right. However, in hindsight, right, I do look at that and I think it still meant something to God.
Yeah.
He said, okay, you confessed your mine. I'll make you mine.
Yeah.
And so
that's good.
I didn't, my life didn't change. And so I got out of prison. In fact, during that incarceration time, she wrote me a letter.
Don't judge me.
So I was in the,
Found him.
yeah.
It's been a long search.
Yeah. And so, there have been periods in my life too, where I had thought of her and I had even gone as far as like, they had those classmates like ads and website where you could like put in a search, but then you had to pay $50.
Yeah.
So I'd like always get to the point of like putting it in. They're like, we found four people with that name that are your potential match. And I was like, it's a gimmick. I'm not paying. They're just trying to get money. So I never paid for it. So, but she had said, hey, thinking of where I was at then, probably like, I wonder if he ended up in prison. And she wrote me a letter. And so we started, corresponding through the mail at that time. And then I actually did go to boot camp and she came to visit me there. And she picked me up from there when I was released and then started our second. So during our childhood, there was about that 3-year period from 4th grade until I went to boot camp at around 13 where her and I were semi together, but good best friends too. And my brother was part of that too. So she knew both of us. And so, then, that kind of came on and my commitment too, right. Was, that for sure, I definitely am not going back to prison.
Yeah.
But also like I had ideas to stay sober. I didn't value it in the same way, but I thought, well, if it leads me back to prison, it's not something I want to do.
Yeah.
And so that was my ideas coming out, but, without much else having changed, though I was a professed Christian, I wasn't a following Christian.
Yeah.
She was a believer. She was a Christian, which is probably why she was willing to try with me and out because I was professing anyway.
Yeah.
But my lifestyle didn't line up to that. My belief systems showed that I didn't really, I didn't follow through on stuff like that. It wasn't a priority for me. I was more interested in trying to do what I wanted to do to be successful and survive.
Yeah.
And then trying to manipulate God into that and using God as a manipulative.
Bring him along for the ride.
Yeah.
Cool with this guy. Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, even one of the things, if I could say, is like even one of the things that her belief system, even though I was a professed Christian, should have included for me was that we shouldn't be having premarital sex. Of course, I'm very manipulative and very persuasive and good looking. Just kidding.
You are pretty good looking.
So she became pregnant, and that didn't go well, right? Because I was not living right, and she was, and so she quickly separated herself from me. Because I had started, there was a drug out called K2 or Spice at the time, and I was on probation. I got into a car accident too, and so I had access to prescription pills. Yeah, but so it was actually my brother. My brother actually said, "Hey, tell him you don't want Vicodin. Tell him you want this kind of pill." And so I don't even want to start naming that stuff, but I started getting them to have access to them, and then I started taking them, and that kind of started about a year or so where I was taking abusive levels of prescription pills, and then I started purchasing them through my connections from Mexico, like thousands of pills to sell. And so because my probation couldn't nail me for a dirty UA on those. So I was using them.
Wow.
Every day, probably 30 pills a day.
Wow.
It's just an insane, it's insane amount of, it depends on what milligram, I guess, but 10 to 30 pills a day. Partying, a lot of hallucinogens don't show up in UAs either. So I was going to music festivals and doing all that. So it didn't take long. That was the period where then I ended up being rated. My daughter came to stay with me. Her and I had already been separated. She was pregnant, but
She was 1 month old.
or she was born. Yeah, she was
Wow.
just, I actually went. I mean, we were basically estranged or separated, but she did call me the day after my daughter was born. And in the hospital parking lot, like I snorted 2 pills to even go in and see my daughter, brand new daughter, because that's just where I was at. That was where my
Yeah.
lifestyle was at. Everything I wanted to
Wow.
do, I associated with using. And so, like, whether it was a good time, a bad time, a chill time, a social time, like all of it was necessitated by being high, and that was normal for me. That's how I felt normal.
Wow. How the heck did this all?
Yeah.
How did we get to where you are
Yeah.
literally leading like a minute? Like this seems like a repetitive process, and it's like, man, you just like you got to a proximity of like almost making the decision, but like you still weren't changed. Like what was the change that took place that got you to fully,
So
what made it click?
After that, did end up going back to prison after that raid, where my daughter was involved with that one. And then while I was in prison, I'm still in prison. I'm getting caught in prison with drugs. I was smuggling and using drugs. I was actually using meth in prison. This stuff is there. It's just very gang regulated. And so, but I was still participating. I actually ended up going to segregation, and I had doctors manipulated to prescribe me pills so that I could sell them and abuse them.
Wow.
In prison, and they brought me my pills to the segregation cell, and I went to abuse them, and I was sitting there, and some of the seeds, some of those things that they had been talking to me about in this prison fellowship program about being a slave to sin. It dawned on me that I was not feeling really anything special about taking these abusing my medication. And I just thought my salvation prayer, and I do think it was August 5th, 2012. It really stands out to me. Although it still took some time for me to sanctify.
Yeah.
I'm still in that
It was
process.
a process. Yeah. We all are.
But I was like, God, like my life is trash. Look at. Like, you say you want this, like you're like, my thought was like, you're getting a bad deal, but you can have it, because I ain't got nothing. Whatever you got might be better than what I got. And so it's worth a shot. And it was sincere. Like, I do know it was sincere, because of the car accident and other things. So I waived my medications. They had me sign waivers because some of them were like, you can't stop these without. So I signed the waivers. I said, I don't want them. And then that night, I slept through the night peaceably, which was, I had struggled with sleep before that. I also had struggled with back pain when I woke up in the morning. Sometimes I'd like have to really stretch myself out because of the car accident. The next day I woke up, I just got out, and I immediately, that was stark to me. I was like, I slept, I have no back pain. And I attribute it to that simple surrender that I had the day before, saying, you can have my life. Like, do what you got to do, because I ain't got nothing left. And so I immediately attributed it to that, and I had a desire to know who God was. And so I actually read through the Bible and the entire thing from the cover, of course, to the back in the next 30 days while I was in that segregation cell.
Wow.
And I had new sensitivities to things where previously were common days, sensitivities to cursing and sexual sin in my life. There's consideration there, where it previously was never been a thought. I considered, like, and it was affecting me, like I didn't think I should be doing that. Yeah. A sensitivity to what's called sin, and so I was kind of wrecked from that point on, even though I got out of prison. I spent 40 months in prison that time, and her and I did try again. I spent a lot of time corresponding, learning about God by going to college all during that 40 months. And so I do think my conversion at that point was sincere. Although when I got out, I still didn't take root. I didn't have connection the way I think I needed it. Didn't have structure the way I think I needed it. And I didn't know and then as a result of that, I struggled with who am I with this identity. And so the easiest thing to do was go back to the things I'd always done. And so when there was problems, especially, I turned to alcohol, I turned to drugs. to soothe myself.
Yeah.
Instead of turning them to God. And so quickly that
30 months.
X spiraled out. Like it was like at that point, I feel like once you belong to God, like a good father doesn't let you go astray like that. You know, he will do everything and still considering your free will to provide opportunities for you to be, you know, to be who you're called to be.
Yeah.
So within 3 months, just drinking, there's actually, I got into a domestic with Christina. I was super intoxicated. And that resulted in me being arrested and going back to prison for another year. And at that point she had said that she wasn't going to do another bid with me after that. And she stuck to it. She did not. And, I ended up pleading that down to a terroristic threats, but it was a domestic. And, I did a year, and then I moved out of state. My adoptive father actually, lived in Utah, and Utah had much lighter probation regulations than Minnesota, and so I figured that's my best shot of getting off probation. I did. So I went down to Utah, although while I was on probation down there, I was still using, I was still drinking on probation, on parole, but I made it off parole, and then I just was like, now I'm really close to the border, and so it was like really easy to just start running drugs again, and that's what I did. Ended up coming back to Minnesota with that, new connections and all that stuff. Yeah, and then continued that life here. So I've been to prison 3 times at that point. I ended up getting arrested, and every time I'd been arrested, by the way, I applied for this program, Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge, because they use it as oftentimes as a deferment program to get out of going to prison. Twice my charges were pistol charges, and I had a mandatory sentence, and then other times I just didn't make it. I never checked in. And this final time I was supposed to go to Teen Challenge. I'd actually been accepted by the courts to go, but every time I get arrested, I would bail out because I had a little bit of money, and a little bit of my brother was out there, so he'd bail me out too, and I'd get another drug charge. I ended up racking up 4 narcotics charges for methamphetamines. And finally, though I had 3 different counties all in agreement to let me go to Teen Challenge, finally Hennepin County, after the 4th drug charge, said, we're done playing this. Like, you just keep bailing out. It's just getting worse. Like, you're a risk to society. You're going to prison. And they sent me back to prison. They gave me 44 months, and I served 30 months. And while I was in prison this final time, of course, I go back to the prison fellowship. Honestly, it was a better place to do time. Their units less locked down than other units, and so for that reason I knew it was a place I ought to go. But I also did feel like God wanted me to go back there. And while I had just got there, I found out through a mutual friend of my brother and I that my brother had been in a devastating motorcycle crash. So as you can imagine, like, super close to my brother. And I wish my daughters, right, or had been enough, but it never was. And my brother, though, had actually crashed his crotch rocket going over 100 miles an hour. The reason was he was under the influence of both heroin and meth. Probably, I don't know how long he'd been up, but that was normal, right? Like, this is the way we lived every day. So he probably literally nodded off.
Wow.
On his motorcycle going over 100 miles an hour, slid under a guardrail. He had a helmet on, so it saved his life. So always wear a helmet. I always recommend people do that where it's recommended. But he about cut his body in half because his body slid under the guardrail, and when it hit the guardrail, it almost severed his right arm off his body. He was barely just hanging on by some bone, and his right hip was crushed. His right leg was nearly severed off. He laid out on the freeway for over an hour, and he bled out so much that his brain had a stroke. And so what happens with that oftentimes is the left side will go paralyzed. And so he's in the hospital, and I get the phone call, or I get my brother's mutual friend, my brother's address was actually listed at his mother's address. And so I'm doing prison time with basically our good friend who's my brother's listed address. And so it's very close to home, and he comes in, he's like, hey bro, sit down. And I was like, your brother is in the hospital and they're about to amputate his arm. And I'm in this prison fellowship program, and I stepped out of the prison courtyard, and I hadn't prayed any prayer in at least a couple of years, because I'd after I went through it with her, I was believing, but I just wasn't taking root. But I was devastated that things, though I was so believing in God that it didn't work out the way I wanted to, that ended up in a domestic, ended up back in prison, and now I'm selling drugs again. I had the faith still. But I just was so devastated by the results of my life, even though I was still controlling it, that I hadn't prayed and I hadn't considered praying. And I hadn't really been in my faith, but I stepped out on the patio in the prison courtyard and I just cried out to God for mercy. I just was like, God, please, please save his arm. At that moment, I was flooded what I call God bumps now, which was a super contrast to the way that I was feeling. But it was a very like almost euphoric, like there were goosebumps, but just on my entire body felt flooded by these. And I took that as an affirmative. Like it was like this, I didn't have words with it, but I took it as like, I told my friend, actually I went back in, I said, his arm's going to be fine. He kind of patted me on the back.
Yeah.
And he was like, it's going to be okay, bro. I mean, he probably just figured I was in shock, and I probably somewhat was. But the miracle is that his arm was saved. They actually were able to remove muscles off of his right arm, which was paralyzed, but then remove those and use them, implant them into his right arm.
Wow.
To create enough blood flow for him to keep his arm. The bigger miracle, I guess that's the bigger miracle, but I guess I also didn't know that he was resuscitated a few times. He was in a coma for months.
Wow.
Otherwise, I probably would have prayed that they save his life.
Yeah, if you knew that.
But his arm's actually a better prayer
Yeah.
because his life was saved and his arm was saved. So that at the time, I actually, was in this prison fellowship program. They require you to wake up and do 45 minutes of devotions. And so I wasn't doing it at the time.
Yeah.
I was sleeping through them. But when that happened I felt that, I was like, okay, well, I'll wake up and I'll read one sentence from the Daily Bread.
Yeah.
If you're familiar with that, it's a simple devotional, but that first sentence in the Daily Bread is actually a scripture verse. And so I started reading that one verse and then going back to sleep. But throughout my day or week, sometimes that verse would like come alive in some form or way. It would show itself to be true or have some implication in my daily life. And I was like, wow. And I started reading it more and I started getting back into it. And I ended up graduating from that program, stayed as an active graduate for a year, and then had a bookmark from Teen Challenge, it's actually a brochure to go to the program, which I had blown. And I had it inside of my Bible as a bookmark, and I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. And so I was then praying and back into my relationship with God. And I said, God, are you trying to tell me to still go to Teen Challenge? And it was a yes. And so I did. I actually went to Teen Challenge the day I was released from prison. So June 3rd, 2020. So really not that long ago.
Yeah.
And I was committed to doing the long-term program or their Teen Challenge leadership program afterwards. So I just was whatever you want me to do. Like this time, you really can have my life and all of it. Like you direct it.
Yeah.
Didn't want to move on with my life as I started growing through, wanting to be a man of integrity without, I didn't feel right. It didn't sit right with me because I hadn't talked to her in about 5 years. With moving on from without ever talking to my kids, right?
Yeah.
And trying to be like a godly person or a man of integrity. Like it didn't jive, didn't line up. And so I called her just to tell her I was going to Teen Challenge program. And she said, if I went to the long term, like, let's talk. And so I did. I ended up going to long term, and she came to visit me, and then I was able to start visiting with my kids. And towards the end of that program, on a pass, we went to the Blessing Tour Carrie Job concert at Grace Church. And I took that moment to propose to her.
That's awesome.
And she said yes. And so I we ended up getting married shortly after I graduated in September of 2021. So I graduated in June. And then, I started off, and I believe God restores the time. He restores the years the locusts have eaten. And he is outside of time. You would think going to prison, going to commit to a year, 13-month long program is a slow route. and by the world's perspective, sure it is, but what God has done in my life through then has restored the years the locusts have eaten. So I started off
Amen.
as an intern, making less than minimum wage. Started going through the internship was a program called Know the Truth, where I got to go to middle schools and high schools and give a testimony, a lot shorter than this one, but to school kids, right? That, in their health class. And I got to talk about the effects of drugs and how I got here. And one of the schools that I got to go to, I now have been to at least 3 times, was my old high school, the one I was selling drugs at, with the selling the kid in the bathroom. And I got to tell that story there. And you can imagine how real that is, because I can tell them, hey, is that bathroom right there, 3rd floor? It's still right in there. Like, yeah, that's still there. Does it still go down in there? Like, yeah, it still goes down in there. And I'm like, yeah, that's where this story happened. And, and so there's just been redemption. I've got to tell my story to the police departments, to the Department of Corrections. And so that was sort of like redemptive, walking through the other portions of it. Yeah. And then, I became a peer recovery specialist, so supporting other people that were struggling in recovery, walking with as a mentor, as a guide, one-on-one. And then God, through these paths. So one of the positions that I picked actually paid less than minimum, even less than what I was making as an intern. And I told Christina, my now wife, about it, and she's like, well, how are we going to buy a house on that? And I'm like, well, God's calling me to it. And she's like, well, if God's calling you to it, you should do it, And so I did. I said yes to that opportunity, and I got a lot of extra training through that position. And then once I completed that, I just really thrived, and I really had a lot of passion for helping people coming out of substance use. And so I did really well, and was able to then get to a position as a supervisor, and I was managing other people that were doing what I was just doing for the past year.
Wow.
And then after doing that for about another year, an opportunity with Teen Challenge came up to be a regional manager. And when I read this job description, I sent it over to her. And so this job description entails about half of what it does is it goes to jails and prisons, and it talks to the people that are in the jails and in the prisons, and talks about the opportunity to come to Minnesota Adult Teen Challenge. And I sent it over to her. I said, did you read that job description? She said, yeah, it's everything you love and you're good at. And I was like, yeah, and so we did it. And God got us we bought our first home, moved our kids into a new house. They've had a dream of having a hobby farm.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like in the middle of, we've got 2 dogs now. And then since we moved into this new house, we've added 2 cats. We added 10 chickens. And just this week, we've added 3 rabbits.
Wow. Yeah.
So we have a little farm going on.
Yeah.
And,
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's been a blessing, to be able to use some of the things where I was once a cause and a contributor to the things that were happening, and going into those very same places, because it's real, right? When I can talk to the people that are sitting there and say, this they know that's me, but at the same time they can see something different in front of them.
Yeah.
And I think there's hope in that.
Yeah.
And they can have that conversation.
I love what you said in your story. You said it's an aspect that I think that a lot of people don't see. And I always tell people, especially like living in America, I had a guy that came on, and he's from Cuba, and he said, the greatest problem America has in regards to spirituality is that we're too like self-sufficient. And so a lot of people think, they think it's funny. One of the jokes is that you really, you put your faith and your trust and you rely on your sky daddy. And I'm like, yeah, it's pretty great. Like, yeah, you should. Yeah, you got daddy issues. You need to, get back to him. You need to realize and come to the end of yourself to understand your need for him. But a lot of times, I pray that people come to the end of themselves like you did. Like that's with people that are blind to their need for God. I'm like, God, would you bring them to their knees? Not because I want something bad, but it's like Satan is lulling people to sleep with, like you said, you had the guns, you had the money, you had the security, and you thought life was great. But in reality, you were so bankrupt spiritually and had no idea, because blinded with material things. And I just love where you had said, God, you'd come to the end of yourself. God brought you to your knees and said, God, I don't know what you're getting out of this deal, but if you want this life, you can have it. And I think that's what a lot of people miss with coming to Christ. They think it's more about behavior than it is about surrender, that God is the catalyst to your change, not your willpower. So what you said there, if you guys are listening to this, I want you to think about that. Whether you've been in the church for a long time, growing up in the church doesn't make you a Christian. There is a difference between surrender and behaving a certain way so God likes you and you have favor or blessing or good karma almost. But I just thought that was really, really powerful, and I really want to highlight that for people listening. It's the surrender aspect of your story.
So there's also this part of, whether you can relate a little or not at all, there's another side to this too, where there was, Christina and I we had a huge connection because we've known each other for so long, and that was really difficult, I think, for her, even though we had ended on those terms, for her to just kind of let me go. And she had her own conversation with God on the other side of it that I think is important and a part of the story too. Where God kind of spoke to her regarding me too. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about that?
I was just gonna say, yeah, it was just we've always had a bond, and I never let that go from when we were kids. And so me separating from him for 5-6 years based on what I knew it was right for our family and all of us was really hard for me. But I did continue to struggle and cry, pray for him and pray that God would take a hold of him. And there was just this last year before he had went, that I was just praying, and I had always tried to kind of be the one who would fix him, because I wanted us to work, and I wanted it to fix him, and I knew who he really was inside, because I knew him before all this. And God basically was just I have him, just let go, I have him.
Wow.
And I just stopped, and I was okay, I let it out, I cried, and I was all right, yeah, what am I gonna do? You have him, okay. And so I let go. And it was a year later, he gave me a call and was hey, just wanted to apologize, I'm gonna be going to do this. And I was tempted to get in a talk, but I was okay, I don't think we should talk, but good luck with that. And
yeah.
I let go, and
God handled business.
I didn't have to worry about it, and he did better than I could have done.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Yeah. So that was crazy.
It's awesome. God works. The problem is people don't like putting it in his hands and trusting him. It's a lot easier to put it in yours, and not just, in this case, it's Jesse, but a lot and others, it's your life. It's not, ideally it's oh yeah, I can trust God. Then God brings you it's where you have to trust him. There is no other choice. And it's whoa, I thought I did, but now we're in a situation where it's God, do you really got this handled? But yeah, so bro, thank you guys for coming in and spending time with us today, because I truly do believe that this is going to open up eyes of people that have been blind and have been secure with wealth, material things, and haven't turned to God, or feel like they're good with God. But it's the way you talk about God in a relational aspect, it's I don't know what that's like. And for those of you listening, you can experience God. It's more than a cognitive knowledge or belief or growing up in the church. You can experience the truth. Truth has a name. A lot of times I tell people, with the perception of the church and of God, I tell people, odds are you don't hate God, you just don't know him. And if you call on his name, wherever you're at, he's not a God of a building. You can call on his name, and he answers. And you've seen that today with Jesse and his wife Christina. So I pray this blessed you. If you have a story, I would love to hear it. You can email me at pastoralex@bethelsrock.org, or just drop a comment. I would love to hear what God has done in your life as well. But again, I pray this message bless you. You know how to connect to me. I'll have my email and ways for you to reach out if you have any questions about what those next steps look like in following Jesus. But God bless you guys, and we'll see you next time.